So I'm thrilled to invite for a conversation now and then continuing after the service, Masha Gessen. Masha, would you join us?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's great to be here.
So happy, Masha, that you're here. And I want to start, Masha, with a few personal things before we talk about the book. Not everybody in the congregation knows of your journey. And I hope you saw Yelena's video earlier of the prayer for our country. Wasn't that fantastic? You're somebody who understands the journey of seeking freedom. And you're somebody who's had the extraordinary experience of going back to one's home country and then leaving again. Would you mind just telling us of those two journeys toward freedom and what compelled and created the framework for them and where you find yourself now on the journey for freedom?
Sure. Thank you.
As we celebrate immigration.
So I was born in Moscow. And when I was a teenager, or actually a little bit younger, my parents decided to apply for an exit visa to come to the United States. So that was my sort of early teenage years passed under the banner of waiting for an exit visa. And then when I was 14, we came to the States, and I went to high school in Boston, and then came to New York to go to college. And then I became a journalist in the gay and lesbian press in the 80s, writing about AIDS. And then somehow I ended up going back to the Soviet Union shortly before it collapsed to do some stories. And then I kept going back for, more and more. And I finally moved back for what I thought would be a couple of years to work as a journalist. Ended up becoming a Russian language journalist in addition to an English language journalist, and stayed for more than 20 years. And started a family there, had a house, and then Putin started his anti-gay campaign, and I became one of its most visible, possibly like the first sort of big public enemy targets. They threatened to take my adopted son out of the family because he was being raised by a same-sex couple. And as much as I'd had all this bravado, you know, that Putin couldn't leave, and I'm staying. This is my home. You know, we packed our bags and left as fast as we could, and came to New York, where we were welcomed by CBST, among other people. So I've been back for 6.5 years, and I guess I brought the curse of autocracy with me.
Oh, so you're who we can thank.
You can blame
So,
me.
Masha, that's a pretty extraordinary story. It happens to non-Jews. There are non-Jewish immigrants who have come back and forth, but it's pretty rare for Jewish immigrants to this country to go back to their home country. And that's a pretty extraordinary journey that was possible by a kind of a fluke of history, really. And that in some ways the first exile was because of your identity or your family's identity as a Jewish family.
Yeah.
And what I like to say, and you know I say this all the time, I did work on that free Soviet Jewry, so you're welcome. If it was a good thing, you're well, yeah. And then the second time was being part of the LGBTQ community. So you have the unusual medal of seeking refuge, once for being Jewish and two for being part of the LGBTQ community. That's...
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, there are interesting lessons to draw from both of those experiences, and one of those lessons is just how similar they are, but also like what the similarity is. Because the reason I could go back to Russia in the 90s and live there very happily was not that Russians suddenly woke up one morning and decided to retire anti-Semitism. It's that anti-Semitism stopped being state policy.
Uh-huh.
And you know, it wasn't, I could certainly find lots of Russians to be friends with who were not anti-Semitic, but also like, what do I care in the end if people harbor prejudices if they're not enforced by state policy? And I think this is something that's really important to keep in mind now when we talk about, you know,
Black Lives Matter. It's a very important point.
Because we're not just talking about racism. We're talking about racism that is enforced and entrenched in state structures and carried out through state violence. And then the exact same thing as had been done to Jews in the Soviet Union was done to the gays, right? Putin decided that the best way to continue sort of securing his power was to queer bait the protesters who had come out in 2011, 2012, and to signal to people that, if you want to blame somebody, and if you want to go back to an imaginary past when you were comfortable, we can just go after the gays. It's all their fault. And again, because it was violence that was incited and enforced by the state, that's why I had to leave.
I think that's a critical point, and we watch what's happening here, where Jews have been, in many ways, there's been social discrimination and anti-Semitism in American culture from the beginning. But from the beginning, American system protected Jews because of the clause that protects religious minority practice. And I'd have to say, this is really the first time that a lot of Jews are experiencing a government that is siding so openly with some anti-Semitic forces in this country. And I think it's disquieting, to say the least, to Jews who have exactly what you've described, have experienced social anti-Semitism in America, but never in our lifetime has there been a president of the United States which has so openly empowered these white supremacists who are clearly deeply anti-Semitic as a piece of it. And
we have a president who is delegating violence, which is, of course, very much something that autocrats do, right? And you may argue that he doesn't, unlike African Americans, we're not targeted by the actual state structures. But we do have a president who's inciting violence against Jews and many, many other groups.
I think that's a very key point, that element of delegating violence and then being able to deny it in this weirdly, in the confused way of his language, which he throws out, which we all know. So I want to read a tweet that you offered recently, Masha, on this Pride Shabbat, to ask you to talk about it a little bit. Masha tweeted recently, "I avoided the topics of pronouns for a while, but when my new book was coming out, it seemed I had to make a decision about self-presentation. I am trans, non-binary, so I asked to be referred to as they. It's been an instructive few weeks." So do you want to talk about a little bit what you mean about it being an instructive few weeks and what it meant to do this via tweet?
Well, what it meant to do this via tweet was it's really convenient. Like, I mean, you don't have to have
no press releases
with everybody. Yeah, just tweet it out, and everybody gets the message, or most people get the message. So it's really been interesting because a lot of people politely ask me what my pronouns are. Right? I've written about being trans, and not extensively, but if people were paying attention, they noticed. And I kind of usually say, it's they, but I'm not precious about it. And then I stopped saying that because I realized that people were taking that as permission to choose my pronouns for me.
Yes.
What I meant was that, I'm not going to take offense if you slip up, right? Which is a little different. But there's a much more interesting discovery that I made, or actually sort of two realizations. Neither of these is a discovery. People have been experiencing this for decades, and I had experience with this as a queer person long before these particular few weeks. But it's that it's possible for people to take you seriously, or to claim that it takes you seriously without taking you seriously, right? So people pay close attention to what I write about Autocracy and write these great reviews. And what they think that what I say about that is serious, but what I say about myself is folly. Not everybody. I mean, a lot of journalists have been amazing. But for example, there was a great review in the New York Review of Books. There was one of those amazing articles that really takes some ideas and runs with it, and just was a big article, like a conversation. And the reviewer, Harry Kunze, used the pronoun they. And then people started tweeting, "Great story, but the pronouns really, make it hard to read." Seriously? You're going to diminish my ideas and my argument by saying that I don't have the right to self-presentation. Right? That was the most striking experience, because it was just so clear that the person read the story, but I thought nothing of disrespecting me personally while proclaiming respect for my ideas. But what really moved me actually to write the tweets, because I really, I don't care that much. I had more than 50 years of living as a Shia, but what really moved me was that I got an email from a woman who has a non-binary college student age child. But it's been a journey for her to learn to talk about them and use the correct pronouns and to sort of to accept it. And she said, but I really feared for my child's safety and for their being able to find a place in the world. And seeing you and your success and how accepted you are has made all the difference. And it's just a really good reminder that even in 2020,
yes,
there's so many young people out there and so many of their parents who still really need to see somebody out in the public space and say, oh, well, I can get there. I can be a staff writer at the New Yorker. Right. I can have books published. I can be taken seriously. And I think it's especially important for trans people because as my friend Mackenzie Ward says, we're the trans 1%. I mean, so many trans people are in fact unemployed. Homelessness is incredibly high. There's especially for trans people of color, just the issues of physical safety are a daily problem. And obviously I've been incredibly lucky and incredibly privileged, but I think it's also great to signal that, look, over here, this can happen too.
I see that all the time at CBST, how important it is for there to be visibility in ways that we had imagined at this point we might be in a different place. It's simply not true. From all over the country, including New York City. It's not that all those issues have been resolved by any means. And I think the power of what you're saying cannot be overstated. And it helps parents, it helps families, we see it all the time at CBST, people coming and just breathing, feeling like, wow, there are other people who have fashioned a life of meaning and of purpose. So one thing before we move back to the service, and then we'll ask people to join us for 45 minutes of conversation about this. I want to move into the discussion about autocracy. I was really struck in this book, Surviving Autocracy, your description of the autocratic transformation by the Hungarian sociologist, the theory of the Hungarian sociologist. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I only read it. Magyar. Magyar. Uh-huh. And this sociologist is really writing about Eastern Europe, but you have the brilliance to understand that this is actually the first framework to really understand what's happening here in the United States. And I have to say, reading that may help me understand what's happening here in a very crystal clear way. And I was wondering if you would describe his theory and how you apply it here to the United States.
So I've been using Balint Magyar's work for a few years. He's one of my sort of complete, total intellectual lights, and also just a really lovely man. But anyway, he realized a number of years ago that in 1989, when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, we started using the language of liberal democracy to describe what was going to happen there. Right? This is the history of the concept, and we were using it because there was just this assumption that this was the end of history, this was what was going to happen, but also because that's the language of political science. Right? When we talk about countries, we say, oh, do they have free and fair elections? Do they have freedom of the press? Right? So we measure them by the metrics of liberal democracy. But when what we're dealing with is not a liberal democracy, it doesn't tell us very much.
Right.
Something is not there. Right? Okay, that thing is not there, but what is actually there?
Yeah.
Right? Or as Balint says, the elephant can't fly, the elephant can't swim, but that doesn't tell us anything about the elephant.
Right.
So a few years ago, he started.
And I have to say, you're saying that totally made it clear to me. That's what our problem is as Americans that we're in the middle of this. The lava is flowing over us, and we keep grasping for things to understand about what's happening. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think it's one of the problems. I think it's not the only problem with our sort of not the only cognitive problem we're having, but a big one.
Yeah.
So he came up. He started developing basically a taxonomy of these post-communist regimes, and in particular, he's looking at how autocracies get established. And so he said, there are three stages. One is the autocratic attempt, and that's the stage where it's still reversible through electoral means.
Oh, is Masha frozen? All right, I think we might have lost Masha. So, well, maybe we'll return to this when we do. Are you back? Do we have you back?
I am back. I'm back.
You froze a little bit there. The technology isn't perfect.
Okay,
so the first you were saying the autocratic attempt.
The autocratic attempt, which is when it's still reversible through electoral means. And there are all these signs that he says he gives to identify the autocratic attempt. Then it's the autocratic break when it stops being reversible. And then it's the autocratic consolidation. And I thought,
let's just pause for a second. I really want people to get that framework. The autocratic attempt when it's still possible to reverse through electoral means. The autocratic breakthrough when it's past the possibility that an election can make a difference. Is that right? Is that correct? Yes. And then the autocratic consolidation.
Right. And I thought, what an amazing poetic opportunity to use the language developed in Eastern Europe to try to describe what's happening here. I mean, that's justice, but also, that's how models work.
Right.
He has built this amazing model. His book on this is coming out later this summer. It's a 1,000-page tome, and it's very, very detailed. And then, okay, this person has created a model. Now I can borrow it and try to see how much of it fits our reality, right? Obviously, we have a very different kind of history. We have different political culture than the post-communist countries. But what can we look at and say, this helps us understand what's going on? I have to say it was a little easier to apply the model than I thought it would be. I mean, obviously there are things that, like, for example, he says, okay, when you have a monopoly in political power, that's a sign of an autocratic attempt. Monopoly in political power means that a single party controls all the branches of government. Americans traditionally haven't been afraid of that. Right? That to us is not a sign of an autocratic attempt. So you can kind of discount that and say, that may be more applicable to parliamentary system.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the other things he says, he says the autocrat is going to start packing the courts. The autocrat is going to start dismantling the system of checks and balances. The autocrat is going to try to dominate in the information sphere without taking over the media, just dominate, right? And which was an incredibly useful concept for me. So that's the model I use to try to understand what's happening.
And it's incredibly useful to use it as a prism. And you do it more in the book. So we'll continue our discussion after the service. Thank you so much, Masha. It's an honor, a thrill to have you with us again. And we'll continue our conversation, and everybody can ask questions then, and we'll dive in more deeply into the autocracy issues.